In September of 1989, my wife and I were hiking on a trail in St. John, Virgin Islands. We had gone from a hillside. We had walked 2 miles down into a valley to see an abandoned rum factory, and the trip down was just amazing because it was down and gravity works. The trip out, not quite as entertaining because it is up and gravity works. When we got out, we were both thirsty. We had parked by the side of the road, and across the road from the trailhead was a little place. I don't know if it was a bar or a roadside stand. When you walked in, it did smell of the native herb. So evidently they were doing things there that they shouldn't. Well, we walked in and we wanted to get a Coke, and we sat down and started drinking a Coke, and they had a television. And on the television was news reports about a storm that was headed our way. And I was getting worried because I'd been in storms before, and I know what storms are about. And I remember asking the bartender, do you think we're going to get hit? To which he responded with his dreadlocks and Rastafarian accent, "Oh no, man, don't worry. We haven't had a hurricane here in over 40 years. Dude, I haven't been here, and that's what your problem is." We go back to our hotel. We go to eat that night. I'm so afraid I can't eat, which if you know me, you know that's a big deal. And then we decide that we're going to leave the next day. We get on the next ferry to St. John to go to the airport. We get to the airport, and it's closed because Hurricane Hugo is on its way. Melissa and I found a hotel that was high off the ground, and we rode out Hurricane Hugo. I know about storms. I've been in storms. I've been in hurricanes. I've been close to a tornado, as from here to the street. I've seen them pass by our house like the finger of God, choosing what it will destroy and what it will leave standing. I've been in personal storms. The funny thing is this story today is really not about an encounter by the sea. It's about an encounter on the sea. And it's about a storm. See, most people don't like storms. Most people would like to stay away from storms, and when storms come, you feel really uncomfortable. But there are those few really weird people who chase storms. And then the other ones who stand out in a storm because they're paid lots of money to report the storm. But really normal, ordinary, everyday people would really pass by any storm that's headed their way. And you may be this way. I know for me, the storms that come in life that are storms that attack me are emotional or financial or relational, and we like to stay away from those storms. Sometimes those stormy seasons cause us to ask questions. Where is God in the middle of this stormy season that I'm going through? Will God show up? And if he shows up, is this storm that I'm going through, is it part of a bigger plan, a bigger story, or is it just some random act that's going on in my life that I have to endure? The question is this season really just a part of a series of events called life? And you kind of know what life is, right? You're born, you're raised, you go off to school, you get married, you have children, you get in debt, your children grow up, you get out of debt so you can get back in debt again. That's kind of the way life works. It works in these cycles. And is this storm really just kind of a random part of those cycles? And this story today is an answer to those questions. Maybe you've had those questions. But our first big idea of the day is, as we lead into this story, that life's stormy seasons force us to see God and ourselves more clearly. That's what storms are all about. That's what the emotional, financial, relational, whatever storm you're going through or have gone through or wherever you are in that cycle of seasons. These storms are there so that we can be forced to see God for who he really is and to see ourselves for who we really are. They have a way of being terrifying and reassuring all at the same time. And they reveal the truth about us and the truth about God. So having said all that and talking about storms, I want to read this passage of Scripture found in Mark chapter 6, and we're going to read the entire story, verses 45 through 52. Mark reveals this. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch in the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Here's what's going on here. If you were here last week, we talked about the story of the feeding of the 5,000 people. How the disciples had gone out, they had come back on this huge high. They had seen God work in their lives, and Jesus wasn't even with them. And so now they go out into the middle of this deserted place, and God shows up again. And the 5,000 are fed, and they go away, and now it's time for Jesus to go to a mountainside to pray, and these men get back into the boat, probably the same boat that they parked in order to meet the 5,000. As they're going out there, they had seen great success. They'd seen success in their ministries before they got back, and in feeding the 5,000, they had seen God move in a way that was amazing. 5 loaves, 2 fishes had turned into 2.5 tons of food, with 12 baskets left over. And they were riding this amazing high. The problem is that success has a way of creating vulnerability in people. You see, the first lesson that they learn here is a lesson about God. And that is, no matter what storm you're in, you are never alone in the storm. Many people go through life and they live with this nagging, haunting fear. The notion that they're rowing through life alone. A great fear that no matter how many people are around them, for some reason, somehow, they're in this thing by themselves. And often that can be a fear that is incredibly paralyzing. And when I talk about being alone, I'm not talking about the alone some of us experience, the woohoo, the wife's out alone. It's that I have nobody to depend on. I have nobody to count on. I have nobody to lean on. I once saw a picture of a tombstone. It was one of the saddest things I had ever seen. It was a tombstone. It had the woman's name, and an epitaph underneath her tombstone said, "She died as she lived, alone." That's your happy thought for the day. Welcome to Clear Creek Church of Christ. The vastness of the universe sometimes makes us think that there is a randomness to life and that we might be alone. We see the universe and all the things, and we think if there's a God that put all that into space, even if we believe that, how could he know who we are? They suffered with that in Bible times. You read the book of 2 Peter where the people are asking the question, Jesus is gone and he hadn't come back, and everything keeps going. The sun keeps coming up in the morning, the seasons come, everything's the same. And then Peter answers him and he says, God doesn't count slowness the way you do, or a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord and 1,000 years to the day. And the thing that I want you to know is that no matter what storm we're going through, we're not alone, because we have a God who sees eons as nanoseconds. That is willing to wade into whatever is going on in our lives and to deal with it. This next big idea kind of says that for you, and that's God not only sees us in the storm, he engages us in its midst. You see, for God, it's not enough to know the hairs on our head. For God, it's not enough to see the storm coming in our life and to know that we're going to be in it. But he enters into that storm with us. He is a God who is present. You know, there was another man in Scripture that went through a spiritual storm. In the Old Testament, a man by the name of Moses was leading this group of stiff-necked, hard-hearted Israelites out of Egypt and toward the Promised Land. And you probably are familiar with all the stories of the Exodus, and you probably remember when Moses went up the mountain to see God, and down at the foot of the mountain, they had created a golden calf. They'd made it out of the gold. They were doing the golden calf boogie around the golden calf. Moses comes down. God is unhappy, and God says, "You guys go ahead. I'm not going with you." And Moses begs him, "God, if we don't have you, how will anybody know that we're any different from anybody else?" And finally, God relents. Now, you can imagine the emotional roller coaster, the storm that Moses is going through at this time. God gives him the commandments, and he says, "I won't go with you." Then he says, "I will go with you." And Moses is at a point that he had seen the seas part, he had seen the cloud by day, he had seen the fire by night, he had seen the burning bush, he had seen God act, and then he said, "God, show me your glory." In Exodus chapter 33 and verse 18, we read this about God. I'm jumping way ahead, I know. He says, "Show me your glory." Actually, in Deuteronomy 31:6, I got ahead of my notes, I apologize. In Deuteronomy 31:6, Moses is speaking to Joshua. He's about to take over after all that Moses has seen, and he tells him this: "Be strong and courageous, do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you, he will not forsake you." No matter what storm we're in, God is in the middle of that storm with us, and not only does he know about the storm, but he engages in that storm. Lesson number 2, storms almost always expose our fears. You see, the first thing it teaches us something about God. It teaches us that he is going to engage us in those storms, that we're never in alone. The second thing is that storms have a way of opening up and revealing all the things that we fear. It causes us to see ourselves more clearly. In Mark chapter 6, verses 49 and 50, he said, well, when he saw him walking out on the sea and supposed that it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified, but immediately he spoke with them and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Do you notice that they were more afraid of Jesus than they were the storm? I mean, think about that. They were in the middle of the storm and they were comfortable. They just kept on rowing, they kept on pushing, but when they saw Jesus, they were more afraid of him than they were the storm. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon because God's presence is terrifying, and it's more terrifying than a storm. Sometimes when God shows up in our storm, it frightens us more than the storm itself. Because a lot of time when we're going through storms, we'll hang on to the storms. They're predictable. The storms that come in our life are the things that we might feel like we can manage. But when God shows up in our life, it's usually unpredictable. It's usually something that happens by surprise. It's unexpected, and it always shatters our assumptions about what's going on in our lives. And it has a way of revealing the deepest, darkest secrets that we have. So why are we so afraid of these stormy seasons? Well, I think it's this next big idea, and storms make us aware of mankind's greatest deception, and that's the illusion that we are in control. You see, storms have a way of dealing with what's really going on inside us. See, we'd all like to believe that we're in control. And while these disciples were out on the water, they thought they were in control. And then Jesus shows up. And you see, the truth is, we're not always in control. I told you that once that I was as close to a tornado. Actually, it was more than once, as close to tornadoes from here to the road. And I remember we had crawled under our house to be at the lowest part of the foundation, thinking we might be safe there, and watching through the grate, watching this tornado dance around and hit and raise and hit and raise and hit and raise, and thinking it could hit here. There's nothing I can do to keep it from hitting this house. There's nothing I can do to keep it from taking my life. There's nothing I can do, because when storms come, I have lost control. And on top of that, these storms have a way of showing us who we really are. If you look in verse 52, I think it's kind of interesting. It says, "For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves." You remember last week that they were told that God would take care of them, but their heart was hardened. See, these weren't innocent bystanders. These were people that had been with Jesus a significant amount of time. They had seen him heal the sick, the lame had walked, the deaf had heard, the blind had seen. They had seen him raise the dead. They had seen all these things take place, yet they were in a storm and they had forgotten all of that. Their hearts had been hardened. There's a couple of things we can take from that, and one of them is, you know what? You can hang out with Jesus every day, and if you're not careful, you can get a hard heart. You can say that you believe that God works and you believe that God acts, and you can say that God can see you through any storm, but you get in the middle of the storm, and the truth is you don't really believe that. You want to take control. You want to change your circumstances on your own, even though God is the one leading you through that storm. You know, in this room, in our little area, our little part of Chattanooga, most people can insulate themselves from the storms because of their affluence or their position. They're capable of keeping those emotional, financial, relational storms away because they feel like they have a great deal of control. But the truth is, eventually, we all have to face the same storms. We all face the storms of aging. We all face the storms of relationships lost. We all face the storms of death. We all face the storms where we face our mortality. We all face those storms. And there's nothing that we really can do about it except to trust God in the middle of the storm. Because truth is, the big things in life, we're really not in control. It's all because of God's mercy and grace that we're here today. It's all because of God's mercy and grace we're in the situation that we're in. And no matter what storm we're going through, God sees us, engages us, and is there to let us know that he's in control. The last thing I want to talk about this morning is that Jesus uses these storms to set us free from our fears. Now, we're all afraid of storms, but it's an interesting thing. When you finally go through a storm, there's a part of you that is no longer afraid. There's a part of you that learns to trust. For these 12 men in a boat, they all went through this storm together. They all rowed together. But they were afraid of the storm, even more afraid of Jesus, and they were about to get a great lesson in life. And they were about to get a great lesson in who God is. Because he was about to show them that they didn't have to be afraid. There's an interesting passage here. It's in verse 48. It says, "Seeing them straining at the oars, and the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by." I've got that in yellow because I want you to look at that. He's describing what's going on, and he makes this statement, says he intended to pass them by. Now, if you had read Matthew's account in Matthew 14, or you'd read John's account in John 6, which he just briefly mentions this happening, neither one of them used that phrase. Neither one of them. And the reason I point that out is because Mark is the shortest of all four Gospels, because Mark is a to-the-point kind of guy. I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. Mark was one of those need-to-know basis people that if you ask him how his day went, instead of telling you what good happened in the day, he would say, fine. You know those people. So when Mark includes something that nobody else includes, it's important. Because he's showing him, he's saying, you're in the storm, God's with you in the storm. The storm is teaching you something about yourself, but there's a bigger purpose to every storm. And that is so that you can see God. That you can know who he is. Earlier I was talking about Moses and the Israelites and how he was leading them out of the promised land. And he'd gotten to the point where in Exodus 33:18, he said, God, show me your glory. He had seen all this. He had seen the sea part. He had seen manna. He'd seen all this good stuff. And now he's at the point where he's saying, God, are you really God? You ever been there? Where you've seen God work, you've seen him work time and time and time again, but you get in the middle of this storm, and it's like, God, are you really there? God, are you really God? God, can you really do what you said you can do? And Moses is saying, God, please show me your glory. And then God does. As the story goes on in verse 21 and 22, we see that he has a plan here. Behold, there's a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock, and it will come about, while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you there with my hand. And look what he says, until I have passed by. See, Jesus wasn't lost on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus wasn't thinking that maybe if I scoot by, these guys who are in trouble won't see me and they won't think that I've abandoned them. He wasn't out on the water saying, you know what, they need to learn to handle these things alone, so I'm going to pass them by. What he was doing is he's saying, I want to remind them of a story that they know. I want to remind them of Moses when he was in the middle of his storm. That God hid him in the cleft of the rock, that he had always been safe, and that it was when God passed by him that Moses saw his goodness and his glory. And out on the middle of the sea, he knew that it was only when they saw the goodness and glory of God that they could be set free from their fear of the storms in this life. Truth is, unless we can get to the point in our lives where the goodness and glory of God are more beautiful than the goodness and glory of this world, if we can't get to that point, we will never be free from the fear of storms. We'll never have peace in our hearts, and our heart will always have this crust of hardness to where we intellectually know of God, but down deep, at that gut level, we're just not really sure we believe all this stuff. They were led to the middle of a sea to have an encounter that would change their lives. Kind of to eclipse and to tie all this together, there's another account of this, and it's an account in Matthew, and you probably are familiar with the Matthew story. The Matthew story has Jesus going out on the sea. He doesn't mention passing him by. They're still afraid, but there's an encounter with a man by the name of Peter. Peter's in the boat, and they see Jesus. They're terrified. They think it's a ghost. The sight of Jesus is more frightening than the sight of the storm, but Peter does something really unique. He says, Jesus, if that's really you, which I think is a cool statement. He'd just seen him a couple hours ago. He knew it was really him. But Jesus, if that's really you, let me walk on the water. I mean, I know what's going through his mind. What he's thinking is he's thinking, Jesus, people don't walk on the water, dude. That's not what's supposed to happen, but I see you doing it, so maybe I can do it. And I have to admit, that was incredibly faith-filled, or it was incredibly stupid. It just depends on who you are and what you think. But I can tell you that I would have been one of the other 11 in the boat. I would have been the other 11 who were afraid of the storm and even more afraid of trusting Jesus. instead of stepping out and walking. And you know, as the story goes, he does step out, he takes a couple of steps, and then he starts looking all around him, and he sees the storm all around him. And it's funny how when we take our eyes off Jesus and we start looking at things going on around us, so for some reason we start sinking. And Peter did too. The beauty of the story is this: as Peter sinks, he says these words, "Lord, save me." You remember what happened next, don't you? Jesus reaches down into the water. He pulls Peter up. He challenges his faith, and the storm stops. Fast forward. You see, a couple of chapters over, in chapter 11 of Mark, Jesus would go into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry. We call it Palm Sunday. It's what we celebrate, many people celebrate today. The Sunday before Easter, and what happens is he's on this donkey, he's going into town, and the people are laying palm branches on the ground before Jesus, crying out, "Hosanna!" And they were praising God. And in the Lucan account, we know that the disciples are saying, "Jesus, tell them to stop." And Jesus' words were, "If they don't praise me, the rocks will cry out." It was an amazing time. And then he would go into the city, he would sleep overnight, and then he would go into the temple the next day, and he would turn over the tables of the money changers. And it was as if he was telling all of the Jerusalem and all of the Jews, he was saying, here's what's happening. The perfect storm just started. I am the Messiah. This is going to change. Hit me with your best shot. And to quote Pat Benatar, fire away. He goes out and he teaches. But he knows his time's short. He sits down with his disciples. He has that last supper, that Lord's Supper that we'll partake in just a few minutes. And he knows that there's one in the group that would betray him. And after the betrayer leaves, he knows it's not going to be long before they come for him. He'd already said, hit me with your best shot, and he knew it was coming. And so now he goes with his disciples, the 11 who are left over, into this little garden called Gethsemane. He tells 8 of them to stay where they are, and he takes 3 of them a little deeper in the garden with him, Peter, James, and John, his inner circle, and he has them to sit for just a minute. And he goes off to himself, and he starts praying. A passionate prayer, a gut-wrenching prayer, one that caused great drops of blood to come from his forehead. And what he prayed was in essence the same thing that Peter said in the water. Lord, save me. He looked around him and he knew what he was about to go through. He knew that he would be beaten to a pulp. He would go through a mock trial. He'd be stripped naked. He'd be hung on a cross, and he'd be placed in a tomb. And he knew all that was going to happen. And in his heart of hearts, he looks at God and says, God, please save me. And in Mark 14:36, we read these words where Jesus is there in the midst of the garden, and he says this, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. We go back to the Sea of Galilee. We see Peter sinking, crying out, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches and he pulls him up. We go to a garden where Jesus cries to the Father, save me. And the answer is no. The Father was willing to allow his Son to drown in our sin, to drown in the very essence of who we have become. He drowned in our brokenness. He was placed on a cross in our place. And he did it because he felt like that was the best choice. And Jesus says, it's not my will, Father, it's your will be done. And I want us to understand when we leave here today this last big idea. And that is that Jesus willingly waded into the depths of a storm that we can't even imagine so that we wouldn't have to. Jesus willingly went into the garden and said, I know what this is going to be like, and I really don't want to do this, but I'll do it. And he waded into a storm that you and I will never see. He waded into a sense of brokenness that you and I will never experience. He went into the consciousness of a tomb that you and I will never be conscious of. He destroyed a hell that we'll never see. And he did it so we wouldn't even have to think about it. The beauty of this story is this. There are really two types of people in this world. When you get down to it, when it comes to storms, there are pretty much two types of folks. There are people who are in the middle of their stormy season, whatever it is, or they've been through a storm and they know they've been through a storm. And they're looking for something in that storm. They're looking for someone to save them, but they've been through that storm. And then there are others who go through stormy seasons and they just don't even know that's what's happening to them. And that might be you. Maybe this morning you've thought about it, thought, well, maybe that's what I'm going through. But you know, whether you're someone that's in the middle of a storm and you know it, or you're someone who's in the middle of the storm and you didn't know it till now, or maybe you're in the middle of a storm and you don't know it, but you're going to figure it out later, I got good news for you. Just like Peter, if you'll cry out, Lord, save me, he will. Because in the middle of your storm, God not only sees us, he engages us. I hope for you that the goodness and glory of who God is more beautiful than the goodness and glory of this world. I hope for all of us that we understand that not only does God engage us, but we can see the fears in our life and we can come to an understanding that he's in control and we're not, and that we can turn our lives over to him. Because if we will cry out, Lord, save me, without fail he will.